The United States is one of the top soybean producers in the world. In 2022, farms across the country produced around 4.3 billion bushels of soybeans, with the soybean sector contributing an average of $124 billion to the U.S. economy since 2019. Soybeans are a versatile crop used not just for food but also as a fuel and feed crop globally. Compared to other crops grown in the U.S., corn and soybeans are by far the biggest, but soybeans haven't always been such a major crop here. In 1960, soybeans were just an alternative crop that only a few people were experimenting with. Since then, soybeans have become an important crop, and U.S. soybean exports have exploded. Today, the U.S. is the second largest soybean exporter, and the crop's contribution to the economy keeps growing. About half of U.S. soybean exports go to China, but the 2018 trade dispute highlighted the risks of relying too heavily on one market. Let's talk about how soybeans became such a valuable commodity, from food production to the U.S. economy and geopolitics. Soybeans are primarily grown across the Midwest, with planting starting between April and June and harvest beginning in late September. On any farm, farmers rotate fields of corn and soybeans every year. You probably won't find a farmer growing just soybeans because they do better when rotated with other crops. Rotating crops helps keep the soil healthy and productive. For example, corn uses a lot of soil nutrients, but soybeans take nitrogen from the air and replenish the soil. There's a yield drop when you plant corn after corn or soybeans after soybeans, so rotating crops really makes a difference. The average soybean yield in our county 40 years ago in 1980 was 31 bushels per acre. Today, that same acre produces an average of 51 bushels, often much more. Over the past few decades, U.S. soybean crop yields have doubled and prices have quadrupled. In 2018, for the first time since 1983, there were more acres planted with soybeans than with corn. Soybeans produce two main products, meal and oil. While tofu might be the first thing that comes to mind, soy is often a less obvious ingredient in things like salad dressings, nutrition bars, baked goods, or canned foods. But those aren't the biggest drivers of demand. The primary use of soybeans is as protein for livestock production. The top consumers are the pork, poultry, aquaculture, and dairy industries. In fact, 97% of U.S. soybean meal is used for animal feed for chickens, hogs, turkeys, cattle, and even fish. With global demand for animal protein on the rise, the market for soybean meal is strong. Back in the early 2000s, the U.S. made about $9 billion from all oilseed crop exports, with soybeans being just a fraction of that. But by 2021, soybean export revenue had skyrocketed to $26.4 billion. The soybeans are often shipped by rail or barge down the Mississippi River and then loaded onto ocean vessels headed to Southeast Asia. China, the world's largest soybean importer, accounts for about 60% of the global soybean trade. This dates back 25 to 30 years when China began moving its middle class from rural areas to cities, and more people started buying meat. However, in 2018, the trade dispute drastically changed U.S. soybean exports to China. China, which had been the top buyer of U.S. soybeans, suddenly imposed tariffs that made U.S. soybeans much more expensive. This led to a sharp decline in exports to China, leaving U.S. farmers with more supply than demand, and prices dropped, putting pressure on farm margins. Even though the U.S. and China reached a Phase 1 trade deal in 2020, global trade patterns had already changed. By 2021, Brazil had become the top soybean producer, hitting record levels. The U.S. once held about 75% of the world's soybean export market, but that's now down to 25 to 30%. Despite this, in 2022, U.S. agricultural exports to China hit $36.4 billion, with nearly half coming from soybeans, totaling a record $16.4 billion. To stay competitive, the U.S. needs to match Brazil and Argentina on costs and find new markets. The U.S. is also focused on boosting domestic demand and developing alternative uses for soy, including bio-based products and renewable fuels. Nearly 40% of U.S. soybean oil is now used for biofuels like renewable diesel. If you found this content interesting, be sure to follow us and like our content for more updates on agriculture and global markets.